All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're throwing on our historical detective hats to figure out exactly how ancient Christian texts and the core doctrines that go with them were actually forged over the centuries. This wasn't something that just magically happened overnight. We're talking about hundreds of years of fierce debates, super meticulous scribes, and these massive, monumental councils. It's honestly an incredible story about the survival and selection of ideas that literally shaped the course of history. So let's just dive right in. We're starting with a massive controversy in modern academia. The big question historians are wrestling with today is this: did the earliest followers of Jesus actually share a unified faith? Or was the ancient landscape just this chaotic web of competing groups, what some scholars call competing Christianities? How you answer that kind of changes how you view every single text that managed to survive. Okay, since we're covering over 300 years of really dense history, here's our roadmap for today. Number 1, the modern diversity debate. 2, forging the fourfold gospel. 3, creating the biblical canon. 4, the Council of Nicaea. And finally, number 5, keepers of the text. All right, moving to section 1, the modern diversity debate, unpacking the roots of orthodoxy. A major starting point for us here is the Bauer-Ehrman thesis. Named after the German scholar Walter Bauer and popularized by Bart Ehrman, some scholars really champion this view. They argue that early Christianity was basically a seething mass of completely diverse factions. And from this perspective, well, what we now call heresy actually came before orthodoxy. The whole argument here is that the version of Christianity that eventually won out, specifically the Roman Church, just used its sheer political and ecclesiastical muscle to enforce its specific views, taking all the other competing equally ancient views and just slapping the heresy label on them. But, this is fiercely debated. Other scholars push back hard on this idea, which you can see in the book The Heresy of Orthodoxy by Andreas Kostenberger and Michael Kruger. They argue no, there actually was a unified doctrinal core rooted right in the original apostles from day one. They suggest it's actually our modern culture's absolute obsession with diversity that's kind of distorting how we view early Christianity. In their view, the early church wasn't inventing orthodoxy through a power grab. They were just recognizing a truth that was already there. Let's head to section 2. Forging the fourfold gospel, from anonymous texts to named authors. To really get what these historians are arguing about, we've got to travel back in time and look at the surviving evidence ourselves, right? Starting with the foundational texts, the Gospels. And here's a mind-blowing fact. The 4 texts we now know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were initially circulated completely anonymously. As scholar Francis Watson points out, the original authors didn't sign their names to these works. The focus was just on Jesus. It was actually the later Christian readers and the developing church that eventually attached those specific apostolic names, basically to tell them apart from a growing sea of other gospel-like writings floating around. Now, formalizing these 4 specific texts took a really major step around 1800 CE. That's when Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyons, drew a really firm boundary line in the sand. He insisted on a strictly fourfold gospel. This was a super deliberate move on his part to separate what he considered orthodox texts from all the competing unauthorized apocryphal writings, stuff like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter. For Irenaeus, it was like a giant puzzle. These 4 Gospels provided different, complementary perspectives of the exact same foundational truth. Moving right along to section 3, creating the biblical canon, drawing the boundary lines. So this boundary drawing, it definitely didn't stop with just those 4 Gospels. If we map this out across the centuries, we see this really gradual progression of early canon lists. It starts with the Muratorian fragment in the late 2nd century, then moves through theologians like Origen and Eusebius, all the way down to Bishop Athanasius in 367 CE. He's the one who finally listed the exact 27 books we see in the New Testament today. And look, this wasn't a sudden decision. Actually, scratch that. It was the exact opposite of sudden. It was an incredibly slow, totally organic process of regional churches comparing notes for centuries on which texts accurately reflected the apostolic tradition. The early church essentially categorized all these writings into 4 buckets. First, you had the universally accepted texts, like the 4 Gospels and Paul's letters. Then you had the disputed texts. These were known, but there was some hesitation about them. Then, interestingly, there was a commended category. Think of it kind of like the early church's supplemental summer reading list. Books like The Shepherd of Hermas, great for your own private reading, but not considered authoritative enough to teach from on a Sunday. And finally, the rejected books, which were often viewed as straight-up forgeries or just totally foreign philosophies. When we look at the raw data for just those final 27 books of the New Testament, a really fascinating picture pops up. Nearly 75%, so 20 out of the 27 books, were accepted almost immediately and universally by the early churches. Meanwhile, the other 7 books faced a significantly tougher road to approval, usually because people weren't completely sure who wrote them or there was a lively debate about their specific content. Take a look at this quote. Peter left behind one letter that is acknowledged, and possibly a second, but it is disputed. That's from the early theologian Origen, and it just perfectly captures the incredibly meticulous, kind of hesitant nature of this whole boundary drawing process. Notice his language there. They weren't just rubber stamping these documents. They were deeply critical, openly acknowledging when a text, like 2 Peter in this case, was debated among different congregations. It really shows off a highly analytical approach to preserving what they believed was authentic. Let's jump to Section 4, the Council of Nicaea, defining the divine nature. Okay, so the texts are slowly getting sorted out, but deciding on the text was honestly only half the battle. The early church also had to figure out what those texts actually meant, especially regarding the very nature of God. And that brings us to a massive pivot point in history, 325 AD. Emperor Constantine had just ended the state persecution of Christians, and he summons over 300 bishops from across the empire to the Council of Nicaea. Keep in mind, some of these guys literally still had physical scars from Roman torture, and now they're being hosted by the emperor himself. They gathered to resolve a huge theological dispute that was basically threatening to tear the whole movement apart. The entire conflict basically boiled down to this one direct comparison. In the left corner, you had Arius, a church elder from Alexandria. He read the text and concluded that Jesus, the Son, was a spectacular, totally perfect creation, but, keyword here, creation, meaning he was made after the Father, so he wasn't strictly eternal. On the right side, you had Bishop Alexander. He argued, absolutely no way, the Son existed co-eternally with the Father and was made of the exact same divine substance. So after over a month of just incredibly intense debate, the council decisively drew the ultimate doctrinal boundary. They overwhelmingly sided with Alexander, affirming Jesus' absolute divinity. Arius, he was excommunicated and officially declared a heretic. But beyond the theology, they also used this massive gathering to standardize the whole structure of the church. They set rules for clerical behavior. They picked a standard date for Easter. Nicaea was really the moment Christianity formally defined its core orthodox structure. And finally, Section 5, Keepers of the Text, Scribes, and Transmission. All right, we've talked theology, but now we've got to look at the actual nuts and bolts of history. How did the physical words of this newly defined orthodoxy actually survive all the way to us today? Well, the transmission of these texts obviously wasn't digital. It was a grueling, entirely manual process driven by ancient scribes. Imagine copying a manuscript by hand, by the light of an oil lamp in a freezing room. No spell check, no copy and paste. Because of this, scribes occasionally introduced variations or tweaked the text, and that reality leads modern scholars to a massive question. Did these keepers of the text faithfully copy the words, or did they deliberately tamper with them to fit a specific theological agenda? As you might guess, this is another area of fierce debate. Some scholars, kind of following that Bauer-Ehrman line we talked about earlier, really emphasize the changes made by scribes. They argue the scribes altered the text to enforce orthodox doctrinal clarity. But opposing scholars counter that, well, sure, some minor alterations definitely happened, but the sheer unprecedented volume of surviving ancient manuscripts, literally thousands of them, means textual critics can just cross-reference them. They argue that because we have a mountain of data, the original wording hasn't been lost, and the core narrative is totally reliable. So, having unpacked this absolute roller coaster of a historical detective story, from the anonymous Gospels to the wild debates over the canon, the dramatic showdown at Nicaea, and the painstaking manual labor of ancient scribes, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Whether you look at early Christianity and see a chaotic battle of competing factions, or you see a unified movement defending its core truth, there is just no denying that the meticulous transmission of these texts profoundly shaped the foundations of the world we live in today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the history behind the history.